Hi, I'm Mr. Simons, and in this video we're going to look at what are the limitations of different economic policies. So we're going to focus on fiscal policy, monetary policy, and microeconomic reform, and we're going to look specifically across three different constraints or issues when governments are trying to formulate policy. Governments or central banks, really. Anyway, this feels very rambly, so why don't we just get started? So the first limitation of policy, let's take a look at time lags, because in an ideal world, as soon as the government or central bank sees a problem, they'd like to put something in place that solves the problem. That'd be ideal. Even for us, that would be really great. But that's not how economic policy works, that it takes some time for various policies to be put in place. And by put in place, we're just saying implemented, and then for them to have their intended impact, so their effect. So let's take a look firstly at fiscal policy. So remember, we're thinking about time lags and fiscal policy. So fiscal policy is announced essentially once a year in Australia at the federal budget, because remember, fiscal policy is the use of the federal budget to achieve different economic objectives. So in terms of when it is implemented, you've got that once a year, usually in May. Sometimes it's a bit different based on elections and things like that, but usually that takes place in May. So then we think about that, okay, so that's in terms of the implementation. What about the impact of fiscal policy? How long does it take from announcing a budget to it having an economic impact? And that in reality, fiscal policy has a very quick effect, a quick impact on the economy. So let's think about it this way. If in the budget the government announces large-scale tax cuts, that will change people's behaviour very quickly. If the budget is announced in May and the tax cuts take effect from the new financial year, so say the 1st of July, people's behaviour will change straight away. So if you are cutting tax rates, more money in people's pockets, they're going to increase spending, and that will start to have an economic impact. So fiscal policy implemented once a year, but may only take a few months to have an impact. Okay, the second policy we'll take a look at is monetary policy, the RBA's use of the cash rate to achieve economic objectives. And in terms of this, in terms of the implementation of monetary policy, the RBA meets once a month, with the exception of January, but it meets once a month. So the monetary policy changes can be implemented very frequently. They can be implemented every month, 11 out of 12 months a year, if the RBA wants to do that. But in terms of the effect or impact of monetary policy, it takes much longer for changes in the cash rate to lead to changes in interest rates, to lead to changes in the actual economy. So what economists believe is that it takes around 6 to 18 months for changes in the cash rate to affect the economy, for all of those changes and influences and differences in behavior to actually result in differences in the economy. So around 6 to 18 months is the implementation lag for monetary policy. That's a pretty good expression. Economists will understand that implementation lag of monetary policy. Okay, in terms of microeconomic reform, micro reform being those big, large-scale supply side, so focused on firms, changes that aim to increase the productive capacity of the economy. Now, it's not a bad definition. You might want to write that down and have that ready. Anyway, with micro reform, it takes a long time to figure it out. It takes a long time to put these large-scale policies in place, particularly also because some of them could be controversial, which we're going to have a look at in just a minute. So micro policies, they take a long time to implement, to come up with and to put in place. But then they also take a long time to take an effect. For example, if the government was doing a large-scale micro-reform to increase the productiveness of people and firms through, say, a national broadband network, the government can't set that up in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. It's going to take a long time to figure out, so the implementation, and a long time to have that impact for it to flow through the economy. So when we talk about micro-reform, that the implementation is long-term and the impact is also long-term. Our next constraint, or our next limitation of policy, involves political constraints. And political constraints don't apply to monetary policy, because monetary policy, while we consider it government policy, is implemented by the Independent Reserve Bank. There is no political influence there. So in terms of fiscal policy and micro-reform, that there can be a number of political constraints that could limit policy. For example, in terms of fiscal policy, the government might need to get its changes through the Parliament, and it may not have the numbers in the Senate. So therefore, the government's political limitations could affect the type of policy it wants to get through. So for example, the government may want to proceed with large tax cuts, but the Senate says we'll only have smaller tax cuts. So that's going to change the type of policy that the government can get through. In terms of microeconomic reform, it could be similar if the government needs to pass it through Parliament. But the other thing with micro-reform and political constraints is that governments don't want to do anything that's too unpopular, because then they will be voted out. So in terms of structural change and structural unemployment, a government may not be willing to go down that path because they know it could be politically unpopular. So therefore, it may not take the tough decisions to undergo structural change as part of microeconomic reform. Our third type of limitation involves global factors. And really this works in sort of two ways. One is that as being part of the world economy and global financial markets, there are some kind of rules that countries are expected to play by. There are rules that countries are expected to uphold. So these include policies like deregulation, open markets, letting the currency float freely, removing protection, pursuing free trade, these kind of policies. So it's kind of like a bit of peer pressure, so that a government can't really sort of re-regulate its economy or impose protection because the global financial markets will be very upset. So the global financial markets sort of impose a constraint on the kind of policies a government can put in place. The other thing to think about is that if the world economy is tanking, if it is going into some kind of global recession, it might be hard for one government to raise interest rates on its own or undergo policies that might be a bit contractionary because the whole economy needs stimulus. So let me give you an example. Let's say the Australian economy is doing really well, but the global economy is slowing quite considerably. There might be pressure on Australia's government to stop running a budget surplus, stop having contractionary fiscal policy, and instead start spending to help stimulate the global economy, even though the Australian economy might be doing quite well. So that the constraint on Australia is imposed by the state of the world economy. So these are considerations that we need to think about as economists when we're trying to put in place different policies. Because we need to think about, well, I want to do this, but what are the potential limitations of this kind of approach? So just to recap, in terms of the limitations on policies, we looked at time lags, we looked at political constraints, and we looked at global factors. Hopefully this was helpful in getting you to understand some of the constraints on government policy making. Any questions, put them in the comments. Always great to hear from you. And as always, thanks for watching.